Mark, you're a high achiever, right? You have your system, you have your process,
I guess.
you know how to do a good job for yourself. But I would imagine that you found that many people don't create systems with the same fervor, maybe don't have the same standards of quality, and now you have to manage people. Mm-hmm. How do you handle it when people start making a lot of mistakes? Do you have a system for that?
Okay. I guess first off, I think I do a very thorough job making sure that I get good employees who typically don't make mistakes. Mm-hmm. And then from there, with a good employee, I typically find that mistakes are made because it's a lack of clarity. Mm-hmm. Not that there's any intent. I think for the most part, a little bit my management style from my perspective, mm-hmm. people want to do well in their jobs, they want to do a good job, they want to satisfy internal and external customers. Mm-hmm. So I look at what did I do wrong? Mm-hmm. And typically, if it's a process that they're working on, did I clearly write out the process? I like to put it on paper because mm-hmm. with paper you have accountability. Mm-hmm. So often I find that training is all verbal. Mm-hmm. And, oh, here's what you're supposed to do. Well, then a month later, they're doing the wrong thing, but they said, well, that's what you told me to do. Mm-hmm. And that's why in my work, I tend to get very specific, where I have all the processes written down with all the work instructions for what they're going to do. Mm-hmm. The person's trained on it by somebody who's already done the process, mm-hmm. and then once they're trained on it, then that person sits over their shoulder and watches them go through the process mm-hmm. to make sure that they hit all 15 instructions on that particular work instruction, mm-hmm. and then when they're complete with it, and I find that really minimizes mistakes within the organization. They're still made, and I'm okay with mistakes mm-hmm. as long as I can kind of understand what was your intent, why did you end up doing this, mm-hmm. and then as long as I can kind of see the thought process behind it, I want to empower people to make their own decisions. Mm-hmm. And I'm okay if there's some mistakes. Hopefully the mistakes won't be really bad ones, mm-hmm. But small mistakes are good learning opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And I want to add another mm-hmm. little question to that, because one of the things you said at the beginning is I make sure I get good employees. And I think that's hard for people.
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't feel like sometimes they actually get put in charge of a department and they didn't hire the people. But even I've noticed that hiring people can be a real challenge. You right. think you've got someone really good, you had a great conversation with them, and then they get on board and, wait a minute, they're not doing what I thought they could do. Have you ever experienced that, and how
Sure.
have you handled that? How do you get to make sure that you got
Sure.
good employees?
Yeah, we started as a two-man organization, so mm-hmm. when we started. So obviously as we expanded, I had to start hiring people. And I learned pretty early on that I wasn't very good at hiring people, because I think I'd hire 4 people and maybe one person. I'd had about 25% of them stick around mm-hmm. long term. And mostly because they just couldn't do the job. The job that I'm in is fairly technical. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of detail, a lot of math, and it's fairly technical. I typically would get a resume, look pretty good, talk to them over the phone, call them in for an interview, mm-hmm. go through the interview process, and then I'd hire them. And I'm mm-hmm. like, they speak well, they communicate well, this is going to work fine. And then found out that they didn't work. And then at that point I brought it up to a business meeting that I had with one of your sessions, mm-hmm. actually, where somebody suggested, and it might even have been you, to test the people before they came in. And where have you worked? I think it was even, you went, where have you worked where people were really good? And I mentioned AT&T. Mm-hmm. And when I went to AT&T, it was an all-day test that you had to pass mm-hmm. before they would hire you. And from what I could tell at AT&T, they had less than a 10% pass rate on that test.
Wow.
So you had to sit there for an 8-hour test, and they took less than 10% of the people who passed the test. So I got some tests from the GNAIL mm-hmm. Series of testing, and I started administering the test to people before I would even interview. And then all of a sudden, people who I would meet with, interview with, get their resumes, who I thought would be great, I'd get the results from the test, and the test said no. Mm-hmm. So then all of a sudden, I started leaning on that test. Mm-hmm. Since I've implemented the test, I would probably say 90% of the people that I hire are still with me today, 10 years, 15 years later.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's a great, and I do remember that group meeting, by the way.
Yeah.
We had it, and I remember also a series of figuring out what test would be the right test.
And this is like 15 years ago.
Right, right. But figuring out what test would be the right test.
Correct.
Because, you would think someone taking a math test but we realized we needed somebody detail oriented.
Right.
So we actually took a test where you were looking at two pictures and picking out what was different between the two pictures.
Right.
And by the way, Mark is not the only one that I work with who has found a lot of success testing people basically on the key skills that are going to make them successful in the job. So I think that's a really useful tool. Thank you.